Welcome.
Thank you.
Well, lots to talk about today after that intro. I'm just going to flick back to that other slide so you've got the hashtags and codes up there if you need them. Now, as I mentioned, you started out as a law clerk. So I'm keen to hear, I don't know if this is the beginning or not, tell us, but how did you go from that background to working in an internet startup?
Yeah, it's one of those sort of serendipitous things, but for me it was a pretty conscious decision of two things really. One is that I could go down the legal path and I could potentially assist 50, 100 sort of clients a year in resolving their concerns, or could I find a way to do something that had a level of impact beyond sort of the people I could interact with one-on-one. And a couple of things happened. Before this, I was running a small not-for-profit in Haiti. That was in 2011 after the earthquake, and then was a legal clerk in South Africa working on some constitutional law. And it was interesting, those two very different experiences, but the theme that ran through it was that the tools that people were using to learn essentially, be it in a school capacity in Haiti or in the United Nations in their disaster recovery efforts, or even for sort of judges to learn in South Africa, the tools that people use to understand professional development concepts just weren't there, which was crazy for me. I mean, it was only a few years ago now, sort of 3-4 years ago, and it was still sort of archaic systems. I'm sure you've all used like Blackboard at university or those sort of systems which are really just filing cabinets for information. Great.
So you then made a conscious decision not to pursue the law kind of career. Is that how that worked?
I mean, so the 4 founders of GO1, we have myself as a lawyer, we have an economist, we have a medical doctor, and we have a software engineer, which really seems like a bad joke, but it's been very helpful. And we all came from it from quite different angles look, we think that education online is done pretty poorly, and also we're on the verge of a revolution in how people offer content online. So how can we try and solve this in a way which we think is unique and more value add? Also, we just figured if I was going to be working 80 hours a week in a law firm, I may as well be working 80 hours a week for myself. And so that was sort of the incubation of the idea, and we ended up just bootstrapping sort of GO1 to begin with.
Awesome. Can we just take a little step back, and did you want to tell us a little bit about your other ventures that you'd been involved in prior to this?
Sure. I mean, I was pretty late, I think, to sort of the startup entrepreneurial world in terms of I was kind of a nerd for a long time, but very like book nerdy, not like cool startup nerdy, book nerdy. And so I didn't really get even the concept in my head of starting something until I was already partway through university. And even then I was kind of thrust into it when I ended up in Haiti via a long-winded story, which is not relevant. And we were helping at a hospital there. And the hospital was being manned largely by out-of-work teachers because all the infrastructure had been destroyed. And so a comment that one of the teachers made, which was, if I had the supplies, I'd teach the kids myself, was like, oh, actually, there's a gap that's being missed. Maybe we could do something about it. So we built a not-for-profit called the School Bag, which now operates over a few different countries, purely student-run not-for-profit, and sort of built that out over my university career, and really, really got embedded in the education space sort of while studying law, viewing it as I genuinely believe that the education space is the most important space to be focusing on in the next 10 years because there's such potential for change and such potential for impact.
Yeah, great. So that's still going now?
It's still going. I haven't been involved for a few years now.
Yeah, right.
Handed over sort of when I graduated from university, but still trucking along and behind the scenes, which is nice to see.
Yeah, great. And some good experience, I imagine, for where you actually ended up, which is...
Yeah, it was
kind of ironic how that happens sometimes, isn't it?
Yeah, certainly it came with highs and lows. I remember one distribution trip, a very first distribution trip where we had all these school supplies. We were like traveling through this sort of Haitian jungle in this truck, and we get bogged in the mud. And so like me being the leader of the team gets out of the car and is like, oh, hey, we need to get these supplies and we need to take them up on carry them up to the school on top of the hill and, be the heroes. And as we're getting the supplies ready, a bunch of sort of the young mothers from the school see us and come down and look at what is happening here. And so, while me being the entrepreneur, right, the young male who's supposed to be in control of the situation, I take one box in my arms and carry it up the hill panting, and these like young women in one smooth movement pick up like 3 or 4 boxes, chuck them on top of their head, and then like run up the hill past me. And like, there's so many of those things, and there's little experiences which at the time you probably don't realize. Like, obviously, so much humility in that situation and appreciation of the need for like really strong female leadership in founding teams and entrepreneurial teams and on boards. I think that sort of going outside your comfort zone is what has helped us to deal with some of the curveballs that have been thrown at us over sort of the building GO1 period.
Fantastic. Well, let's talk about how that all started, because obviously it wasn't, a learning platform when you started back in, 2012?
Yeah, about that. I guess we started sort of just out of high school, and sort of typical, like, as it says, we could work for Woolworths for, $20 an hour, or we could work for ourselves for $2 an hour. We decided to see if we could just build some websites and, ride that website wave. So we started GO1 originally as a web development firm, and a couple of our original sales strategy was to go down Old Cleveland Road and to door knock every business on Old Cleveland Road to try and get a website. And I think it ended up that we door knocked like 100 plus businesses.
Wow.
And we got one website out of it.
That's pretty good for a group of high school students, really, isn't it?
Yeah, it was, again, all these sort of things you don't realize at the time that influence your strategy later on. But that one website led to sort of 10 referral websites, which sort of grew and grew. And so
you did this before the other ventures started. So you were running 2 ventures when you were at university.
Pretty much,
effectively.
Yeah. Although the web development firm was really small, and it never really achieved scale, because soon we sort of realized that in the services space, you can't really achieve that scale which we wanted to achieve. And also our passion really wasn't building better websites, it was building better mechanisms for people to provide education materials and to sort of improve themselves through online education.
So were you all school friends? Is that how
all
that
of
started?
Us were high school friends.
Yeah, right.
Still friends. Although
Good to know. Okay, so you ran that, so during university it was just a bit of a side thing and you did it when you could? Is that how
Absolutely,
that worked? And then when did that change? What was the kind of pivotal moment?
So we all kind of graduated from university around the same time, within sort of a year of each other, and had decisions to make around what we wanted to do next. Was I going to go into a law firm? Was the doctor going to go into a hospital? Was the economist going to go and work for Deloitte? All those things. And by that stage, the web development firm was stable, small, but it was okay. So we managed to spin off part of that and sell off some of those customers, which gave us a very small amount of money, enough to throw into the development of the learning system and sort of put a lot of efforts into that.
Wow. So where did the idea for this learning system, I mean, it sounds like it's something that had been percolating for a while potentially, but at what point did you say, okay, we're not going to continue with that and we're going to take this focus and we're going to do it full time, if that's what it was? Yeah,
I think it's an interesting one, because our business model has changed a lot even since we decided on building a learning system. So our original intention was not much more than us sort of sitting down one day and kind of complaining about the individual systems that we were using online, and thinking, well, maybe we could just build a better system that will enable people to upload content and deliver it. That was sort of all the initial conception was, like, we can do this better than the status quo.
So it didn't come out of a client job or anything like that? It was a completely fresh kind of idea?
Pretty much. Like, there have been sort of hints dropped between some of the websites, like, can this website, deliver an animation that tells our customers how to do X?
Yeah.
But it wasn't like, this is a defined product that we need. But there were bits and pieces along the way that led us to that journey.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay, so great, you decided to build this platform. How long did that take, and what was the kind of process while that was happening?
It's still in development and will always be in development.
Yes.
I guess we're probably our first iteration. It wasn't even called GO1. That stage was called Aduro, which we thought was very clever, because it was like Latin for flame, I think, because we're like igniting online learning, very trendy. And so that was actually built off the back of, some of you probably use Drupal as a content management system. So we essentially reduced our costs by taking what essentially is a website content management system and building up a new user interface over the top. So the back end was already built, we just had to sort of configure. So the initial system probably only took us sort of 4 to 5 months to get off the ground, although it was very buggy. And we sort of weren't paying ourselves at all during that time. It was just like, look, we believe in this, we think we can get it working, so let's push for a bit.
And were you still doing other client work in the background then to pay the bills?
It was lucky that, we had a couple of legacy website clients that could essentially keep the lights on, and it actually turned out mostly were just funding developers to then develop out the platform.
Yeah, so. Great. And what was your kind of go-to-market strategy with that?
Well, that was when we were quite young and we probably didn't even know what a go-to-market strategy was. We were just like, hey, we built this cool tool, people will come, right? It's great. What we really leveraged early on in the piece was the Queensland connection and the Brisbane connection. I mean, our first sort of proper client was Epilepsy Queensland, the not-for-profit there. And so we really leveraged hey, we're a Queensland business, we're based here, our support is based here, we'll come to your office and sit next to you for a whole day if that's what it takes to get this thing set up. Let's just try and get as many Queensland businesses as we can on the system.
Great.
At that stage, it was a SaaS product with a license fee of, I think at that stage, it was $5 per user per month. And we just attempted to get sort of the small corporate market in our first instance,
And were they typically signing up many of their employees to use it? Is that what the plan was?
We usually sign, between 50 to, I'd say, 200 employees in any one sort of contract at that stage of the business.
Yep. Going
back a few years now. But it was simply just a pretty effective way to deliver training that someone else creates.
Yes.
So let's
just, I suppose, explain that in terms of what it was, and then maybe you can talk through to where it is now. So that was a portal that someone would log into and be able to view their own internal team's training.
Absolutely,
and then have some kind of check off that it had been done for compliance purposes.
Reporting, all those sorts of things came part of it, a nice system to deliver training.
Okay.
Probably about 18 months into that, a couple of things happened. One is we started to develop, I think, a little bit more of a mature view of the online training market and where it was headed. Our sort of internal view is that the traditional learning management systems, the blackboards, the Canvas, those sorts of things are declining pretty rapidly, and in a few years' time they will cease to exist as we know them today because of sort of the SaaS business model is no longer applicable in this market. And if you take a few other markets, say for example the online travel, like TripAdvisor.com, so 10 years ago, you would have gone to Hilton.com and Marriott.com and booked your hotel rooms there. You then had Booking.com pop up. Same for the online media businesses like Spotify. A while ago, you would have gone to Big W and bought a CD. Then you had the evolution of iTunes to sort of aggregate those providers and aggregate that content. And now you have Spotify, where you have subscription aggregators. And so we viewed that the education space, the online education space, would follow a similar path. So that has effectively redefined our business model for the past few years. And with that pitch and with that sort of pivot in business strategy, we're accepted into Y Combinator in Silicon Valley, which really started fueling our growth in the US and around Southeast Asia.
Yeah, great. So, seeing as you mentioned it, tell us a little bit about how that came about. Did this new business model had come up, and then how did that lead to Y Combinator?
So we had this existing platform which had a few thousand users on it. I think it was probably 30 to 40,000 users at that point in time, maybe a little bit more. But we're experiencing lots of competition in the market. I think there's 600 learning management systems in the market, probably more than that now. So it became a price war, it became a feature war. We're just up against some of the big players and we're finding it difficult to compete. So we built out really, really quickly an initial concept of an online learning marketplace, which took a couple of training providers we already had a good relationship with and just threw their content together and enabled people to access it through our system. Really, really quickly built. We put it together in about 3 weeks.
So that would be just logistically then, in addition to their current internal training materials, then they could now,
access
for the first time,
materials. So they no longer need to build them themselves, but also had access to best of class. And then at that stage, we were thinking of doing our first sort of capital raise. And so this was at the beginning of 2015 now. And even back then, startup hadn't really entered our minds. The term, certainly the venture capital scene in Australia wasn't what it is today by any means. And that was only a couple of years ago. And so we're going through in our minds, what do we want to do with it? Where do we want to be? And of course, the US seems to be like the holy grail, right? If you crack the US, then you can crack everything, which we've since learned probably isn't actually true logic, but it's a different story.
We'll cover that soon.
And Y Combinator, being like in our eyes, the best technology accelerator in the world, seemed like the best platform to launch our US presence, to build out an office and to really push out this sort of online marketplace of learning content that we were trialing. And in typical, I think, startup world, or definitely in typical my world, we only decided this about an hour before the Y Combinator applications closed. And one of the founders, the doctor, was off-site somewhere, so we had to film our YC video, and we had photo frames of two of the founders that couldn't make it because it was just so last minute. I think we filmed at my grandmother's house, actually. So we threw an application for Y Combinator primarily with the pitch of, look, we already have sort of 40,000 users. We have a revenue base. It wasn't stellar, but we have a revenue base, and we have this new pitch which we think would gain a lot of traction, and we'd like to do it in the US. So that was our pitch for YC. And we were lucky enough to be interviewed. About 6,000 companies applied that year in that batch. And so we got on a plane over to Silicon Valley, went for the YC interview, which was the most terrifying experience of my life. I think I had food poisoning. Andrew, one of our other co-founders, was jet lagged. And the third co-founder that went for the interview is our CTO. And you know how CTOs are with social skills sometimes. So it was an interesting interview nonetheless. And the way sort of the YC process works is if you're unsuccessful, they email you, and if you're successful, they call you. And so we're literally all sitting around in the hotel room around this mobile phone for like 3 hours that night, just hoping the phone would ring. And thankfully it did.
So how many people got accepted into that round?
I think there was 112 companies in our batch. Yeah. I think there's about half a dozen Australian companies that have got accepted.
What do you think made you get through that?
I actually think being an Australian company really helped. Like, I would encourage as many Australian companies as possible to apply. They see thousands of US companies from San Francisco that are looking to solve this and looking to solve that. But we're an Aussie company. We had some traction in Australia. I said it wasn't amazing traction. We had some traction in Australia. And therefore, I think we had a really unique pitch, which was, hey, like, we're getting somewhere. We think we can get somewhere faster and in the US market. Just to help us out. And it worked.
So what did that mean? I mean, that's obviously a big change for you at a time when the business was changing as well. So
absolutely. And I mean, to remove, I think one of the challenges was you remove 3 out of 4 founders and they go and live in San Francisco for 3 months. And the impact that has on your business, I think we potentially didn't estimate the impact that has in terms of removing 3 business members for 3 months to go and participate in this. But I mean, that was one of the challenges. It was overwhelmingly, I think, the most valuable 3 months in the company's history.
Yeah.
It was, it really sort of crystallized our thinking around the shifting online education space and forced us to question our assumptions around the future of the market and to really back ourselves in that process, and ultimately led to our first capital raise on graduating from YC.
I mean, there's obviously a lot more programs around now and locally for entrepreneurs than there would have been then. I'm sure there probably was, very few in Brisbane at least. What do you think, Y Combinator does or did so well that makes it stand apart?
Yeah.
Or what, are there any things that stick out in your mind as being something that was really unique and, wonderful for your business?
I think, unfortunately, YC was one of the first, and therefore it has obviously the alumni network. Which was, I think, like the most valuable thing for us was being able to call up on the YC partners, people who've exited a company for $1 billion, like Justin Can, who exited Twitch, the Airbnb founders, those sorts of people, and being able to go to them after one of the YC dinners or one of the YC sessions and be like, I don't know how to solve this problem, or like, we're dealing with this client, but like, I can't get over the line with negotiations. Like, how would you approach this?
Right.
And therefore, like, the alumni network is really strong, but that's because they've been operating for, I think, 11 years now or something like that.
Yeah.
And in the heart of the valley where all the capital is.
Yeah.
So I think some of the accelerators in Australia are doing fantastic. Like Murudeen, Sydney, some of them are really kicking goals. And I think the next step for the Queensland startup scene particularly, hopefully, is that maturity story where you have Brisbane founders like Mark Sowerby and Steve Baxter, but you have 20, 30, 40 Mark Sowerbys and Steve Baxters who will help the younger founders and the newer founders to answer those questions, which sometimes feels like the world is ending.
Do you still leverage that network these days?
Absolutely.
Yeah? Great.
Yeah.
Awesome.
It's a shared experience because they have weekly sessions, you get divided into groups and they have weekly sessions with the YC partners, and it's a very humbling experience when your idea gets torn apart by someone that you respect a lot. So it's very community building. Yeah.
So when you left YC, what did that mean and what happened then? And maybe also where were you at with, obviously you'd had that new idea. Did it come out looking different at the end of that 3 months?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it came out looking radically different, but it came out with a bit more focus and a bit more direction as to the goals and where we had to head first. And for example, what we would do with the capital raise to scale up. Ultimately, so we raised our first round after YC, and that fueled mostly product development to build out a robust marketplace, and then also fueled the switch from the marketplace into this subscription Spotify model, this subscription aggregator model. And then that started our US presence essentially. So we hired a few sales staff and started a San Francisco office straight after Y Combinator.
Great. Can you tell me, I haven't really gone into what your role was in those early stages. What kind of work were you doing in the business? Obviously with the 4 founders, there was a range of skill sets there.
Yeah, it's, I think actually one of the strengths of our founding team is that we're relatively interchangeable. It's really, really valuable to have a big meeting come up and have 2 people going instead of 1, and those 2 people being relatively interchangeable. So if something comes up or life gets in the way, which it always does, we could always rely on one another. I think that was really important and still is really important. And obviously in a startup, as everyone here knows, you wear 7 different hats in the business at one point in time. So my role at the start essentially was everything except coding. I was building websites and then started to build our system, and then our CTO looked at my code and was like, that is disgusting. So I was banned from coding. So it was business strategy, it was sales development, it was customer support, it was everything at that initial phases. As we grew out, I moved more into the operations role in terms of customer support, in terms of capital raising, in terms of go-to-market strategy, all the way through to legal and finance.
What did that customer support look like? I mean, you did have 40,000 users back then. Was that, taxing to your team to kind of be able to support that?
Definitely in the early days. The system wasn't the most stable thing in the world going back a couple of years. And we had a very young team. We've always had a strategy of hiring people out of university that we know are just super keen to learn and super happy to adapt to whatever the role needs. So it's not uncommon for us to hire someone and then their role to change sort of 2 or 3 times in the first year within the company until they find their niche and where they fit. That's just sort of the strategy and culture we've adopted. I think customer support and success is critical to a new business, and I think it's one of the reasons why we've grown to where we're growing, because we dedicate an awful lot of resources. We still do quite a lot of face-to-face customer support. We'll go and sit with a client in their office in Sydney for half a day, if that's what it takes to get them off the ground quicker. Although we're still adapting to the sort of the 24/7 model, which is new for us. So.
Great. So back to the completion of Y Combinator then. Did one of your team stay in America from that point onwards?
We attempted to do a bit of a rotation schedule, which I think was probably one of the things we could have done better. We simultaneously did Y Combinator or just thereafter, and this is why I say that the America story is sort of viewed as the holy grail, but it isn't necessarily the right one for everyone. On leaving Y Combinator and sort of putting forward this new market proposition, actually our biggest growth there in the past 12 months has been Southeast Asia. So I've spent a lot of my time in sort of Malaysia, driving out a Malaysian team and outreach into Southeast Asia. And so because we were experiencing growth in Southeast Asia and quite aggressive growth, and we were seeing some growth in the US, but believed that the US should be our focus, we kind of divided our attention a bit. And I think that probably led to us not scaling as fast as possible in the US as we could have.
what would you have done differently in hindsight?
I think we would have moved there, yeah, and we probably will be moving there. It will be a necessity, I think, to make the US really, really fly.
So you still have an office there now, though?
We still have an office, still have a sales team there, and they're growing and scaling and achieving success, but it's not to the level which we're seeing in some of the other areas. Yeah.
Okay, and your founders are now not all in Brisbane anymore, is that right?
Technically, we all live in Brisbane. There's a lot of living out of a suitcase these days, so my role was more sort of Southeast Asia, Kuala Lumpur particularly is where our sales and support team is based out of. And US for sort of capital raising operations purposes. Obviously our CTO spends a bunch of his time in Vietnam. One of our early moves, which I think worked really, really well in our favour, was one of our founders is Vietnamese, and we incorporated a company in Vietnam, wholly owned subsidiary of the Australian company, and started hiring out a development team there, and then adopted a quite distinguished, like I think, a direct strategy of having people move between offices as much as possible. So people cycling out of our offices as much as possible to kind of build that team culture. And so our development center in Vietnam now, we think is a really, really high caliber for obviously not the same cost base you'd have in Australia. So our CTO spends most of his time there. And although that has its own challenges incorporating in Vietnam, when we were building the company, one of the sort of requirements of incorporating a company in Vietnam was you had to have a certain amount of money in the bank account for the government to authorize it. And I can't remember what the figure was. For the example, to say it's $5,000. And so we sent across something like $5,300 to account for like banking fees and transfer fees and those sorts of things. And we ended up with like $5,100 in the account. And the government rejected our application because we didn't have exactly $5,000 in the bank account.
Right.
So that was a fun experience going through those loopholes.
Wow. And how did your legal experience come into play throughout this process?
I think extremely valuable. Like obviously, it's as soon as you start getting into the sort of capital raise process, it takes on a new level, which is, I think, difficult to self-teach, but absolutely possible. I mean, we did our first capital raise internally, was myself doing the document sets, and our second capital raise, we had to go out for legal counsel because it was of a bigger quantum. But in terms of initial contracts, in terms of just speaking the language, like one of our first major contracts was with the Queensland government, with the fire and emergency services, and like they bet on us, and we were quite small. We're very grateful to that. But like being in a room, sort of two like 19-year-old startup founders, like probably just more casually than I am now, and like their legal procurement team sitting opposite us, and we're just like, yep, I know exactly what procurement means. So it was helpful at that early stage to, I think, get us across the line in some deals.
Yeah, definitely. Now tell us a little bit about what it's been like founding a business with 4 people, because obviously that's not necessarily the norm. 2 or 3 might be a bit more common than 4. So what's been some of the kind of highlights and also the challenges, I guess, in working with, such a large group of co-founders?
I think the highlights are, as I mentioned earlier, having more people in the founding team, in terms of the really good things about it, means there's a little bit more leeway to have each other's backs and to cycle in and out of some positions and situations when things get really stressful or when something really cool comes up that you think would be really valuable. For example, like in the past 4 years, I took a short period of leave, but I was still working nighttime, to go and work for the UN in New York for a couple of months because I was offered a position there in sort of technology space and in the youth advisory space, which has led to some really cool contracts we're doing with Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And one of the other co-founders went to do a short course at Oxford for a couple of months, and we wouldn't have been able to do that if there was just 1 or 2 of us. But all of those things, even though they might seem sort of tangentially related to GO1 and its core, I think have really helped us mature as a team and to find opportunity in places where we wouldn't have seen it before.
That's great, and that's a really good point. I mean, being such a young founding team, it's nice to be able to still explore some of those other, areas and still keep things ticking.
In terms of the challenges of having a 4-person founding team, I think it's like the challenge of any scaling business, but I think it's amplified when there's, more founders, is as you grow the team, and particularly as you expand overseas, that culture of a company is so important. And maintaining a consistent culture across the whole company as you scale is critical, and potentially even more critical than we actually gave it sort of focus and at the beginning. And having 4 co-founders, obviously different personalities, you've got to approach sort of office culture differently and approach problem solving differently. So it's really important to get us all on the same page after every big decision, get us all in the same room so that we all understand all the reasoning for it, the rationale, how we're going to communicate this out to the team. So, yeah.
Is there anything you do differently in terms of how you guys have worked together?
I can't think of anything top. I'm sure there is many things. And there certainly has been elements of sort of robust discussion on strategy at one point or another, around people thinking we should approach this problem that way or this way. But I think we're pretty lucky that we're all sort of very respectful of difference of opinions, and we can have a pretty robust debate in the room and then leave and acknowledge that this is the decision we've taken and that this is the direction for the company, and we'll back each other in that process.
Great. At what stage did you establish a board or get, external advisors in?
So we had, I guess, informal advisors from quite early on, and there was no structure to this. There probably should have been, but it was pretty ad hoc. People from uni, people from XYZ that we'd met along the way, who were just mostly providing connections and just saying, hey, you might want to talk to this human. We established a board after our first capital raise. So we include that in the documents as a condition of the capital raise. Mostly for good governance, but also, we're lucky to have Steve Baxter as one of our angel investors at the start, a couple of other high caliber people, so we wanted to lock them down and make sure they were supporting us. So yeah, after our first capital raise, we did that.
Let's talk about the funding, I suppose, because you were bootstrapped initially and then you raised capital, around the Y Combinator time?
Yeah, so that would have been August 2015. Yeah.
And you raised $1 million in your first round, is that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Tell us a bit about how that whole process, ran for you.
Yeah, it's still strange to think about, because if you'd asked me 3 years ago, 2.5 years ago, what a convertible note is, or, how does a shareholders agreement work, I'd have been like, I have no friggin' idea. And so it was a bit of a steep learning curve around sort of how this works, but now sort of get your head around it, and it's very sort of mechanic in its functions. What we found in our first round was that we were actually really, really pleasantly surprised at the willingness of a US VC to back an Australian founding team and to back an Australian idea. So we kind of compiled a round that had about half Australian investors and half US investors, angels, mostly high net worth, and a couple of firms, to fuel our growth in Australia and in the US.
Was that something that you did as part of the Y Combinator experience?
That's certainly one of the aims of Y Combinator. It's not the only aim, but I guess any accelerator in Australia, you'll go through the same process of refining your pitch and, I guess, moving towards an aim of scaling and fueling your next growth via a capital raise.
We were talking before and saying that, the whole idea of raising capital is often quite foreign to a startup founder, when they first have to do it. So what was the process like for you? Who helped you along the way? How did you get in front of people?
Yeah, so I think before we went to Y Combinator, we were in discussions with some Australian firms. Transition Level Investments was one, Tankstream was one of them, and a couple of others around Australia, Blue Sky as well. And that was mostly just through connections, but that was still really early on. And I guess the idea of sort of the structure of the capital raise process, seed, Series A, Series B, ultimately to a liquidity event, was still something that was quite foreign to us. So we were still exploring, is this the best course for the business? Do we want to sell off part of the company and then try and scale quicker? Or do we try and increase revenues during the YC process to a point where we're cash flow positive and can then organically grow? So we were still pretty skeptical around that this process is the correct one to follow until into the piece. And then essentially what tipped it for us was got into YC, had sort of a bit of refinement around understanding of the market, and thought that actually, no, we need to go quickly or we'll lose that first mover advantage.
So how soon after did you complete that round?
3 weeks after.
All right.
But we were in discussions for...
Yes. A long time before.
2-3 months before that, yeah.
Yeah, right. And then you subsequently raised another round?
Yeah, end of last year, August last year, September last year.
12 months apart?
About 12 months,
right?
yeah.
And that was 3.7,
3.7,
something
yeah.
like that. Okay.
Yeah.
And going back to the same investors again and adding some new ones in, or how did that?
Combination of both.
Yeah.
So what we felt was really encouraging and is really important to focus on is the pro rata rights of your initial investors. So all of our seed investors had pro rata rights to then top up at the next round, and all of our investors that were eligible for pro rata exercised that pro rata. So that was a really good signalling to the market that actually we invested in these guys when they were smaller. We're going to top up again in the next round. Actually, they're doing some good stuff.
Great.
So we went back to our existing investor pool and then brought in a couple of new ones as well into that round. Again, a combination of Australia and the US.
Okay. And Queensland government is also part of that? Is
Yeah,
that right?
so
Tell us
we
about that.
That was an interesting process. So Queensland government, through one of their Advanced Queensland programs, has the Business Development Fund, which is a matching program for investment into Queensland startups. The outcome for us was exceptional. It was a really, really worthwhile use of time. Essentially what happens is the Queensland government will match your investor's investment into the company, and then there's a buyback right for the company and the investors to buy back those shares at a rate that's only the initial investment plus CPI. So what that means is essentially, hopefully in five years' time, when you're a much bigger company, you can buy back that equity for a very low price just before a liquidity event, and you've just regained X percent, 4, 5, 6% of the company before a sale event or something like that. So it's I think it's a really clever program, and one that worked really well for us because it was a really compelling story for us to go to our US investors and say, like, we're going to regain this capital and we're going to regain these shares prior to a liquidity event. So it was a really effective way to de-risk and to change that risk process and risk evaluation for our investors. Having said that, negotiating a term sheet with government, 9 months.
Right.
I think we were an overtly complicated model because we were the second investment, and we're actually incorporated in the US. So to attract US funding, we incorporated in Delaware and then have a wholly owned Australian subsidiary. So all of our investment money funneled into the US.
Right.
And so we were the first US company, even though all of our operations are through Australia, our financing, our contracts, everything's through Australia, and we're an Australian company. It's a holding company that our US investors invest into. So it was a particularly sort of complex process to nut that out, but it was very, very worthwhile. Yeah.
How much is Advanced Queensland investing in organisations?
So they match dollar for dollar up to 2.5 million.
Right.
Yeah, and that's through the BDF. There's also other programs which give grants for like $20,000. I think the Ignite program is up to $350,000.
Yep.
To kick off projects. So
great.
Yeah.
Definitely worth looking into then.
Yeah, absolutely. We've been the beneficiary of 2 Advanced Queensland programs now. One a much, much smaller one, and then the BDF fund. So
great.
Helpful.
So what's that second round of funding then enabled for you as a business?
2 things primarily, direct sales growth. So we, up until this point, have operated on a pretty traditional direct sales model. So we have a team of account executives, we have a team of lead generators, and so a lot of that funds went into hiring more account executives, hiring more lead generators, and building up that B2B sales process, and then into product development and building out this marketplace sort of subscription model for the company. And so that's resulted in some pretty good growth, I'm relieved to say, over the past sort of 9 months. So it's paying off. Yeah.
Great. And just before we talk about some of that growth, what's happening now from a funding perspective? Are you going to be doing another round, or is that not kind of on the cards right now?
It's definitely on the cards. So we'll probably be beginning those discussions in the near future. As I said, because of our existing sales model, even though we're exploring other sales models, it's a very capital intensive model, hiring more warm bodies to go out there and sell and to demo and to get clients. Ultimately, we have other strategies in mind for the next phase of the business. But yeah, so we'll be looking into a new round to fuel some further growth soon.
Fantastic. And tell us how, the revised model is playing out. How's that working for you in that aggregation space? And I know you've had a recent deal come off, so tell us a little bit about how that's coming.
Yeah, it's been a pretty exciting time. I think it's really, really rewarding to try a new business model and for it to work. We've obviously tried quite a few things in the past and changed little bits and pieces and tweaked pricing models and those sorts of things to varying degrees of success. But to sort of make the jump into this aggregator space and to see it succeed for now in certain bounds is really validating. Just as sort of an example, we 12 months ago would have been selling 90% SaaS probably in terms of software licenses. Now it's probably 50% plus in the content space and in the content subscription space. So we're shifting down the SaaS side of the business and scaling up the aggregation side of the business.
And you were telling me before, just for those people who, like me, want to visualize things a little bit, so rather than necessarily having to come to your platform and logging in to use your learning management system and access content through there, you're now providing that into third parties.
Yeah, I think the really interesting question that all startups need to answer and that we're still answering and still sort of thinking about all the time is how do you effectively achieve scale? I mean, the direct sales model which we've used up until now is succeeding in a growth curve, but how do you get from 500,000 users to 5 million users in a space of months, not years? And that's the really interesting question. And previously, when we were operating as a learning management system and as a SaaS system, we're operating in a really competitive space. Now that you're operating in an aggregator space, you suddenly have a bunch of partnerships that are open to you. So we're opting to partner with a bunch of traditional SaaS players in this space and be the marketplace that then powers their content offering rather than us needing to go out and secure all the companies individually. So it's a sort of a channel partnership kind of play. And I think that pipeline is really interesting and it's just so different for every business. Remember Matt Barry from freelancer.com, when he was explaining how he achieved scale, it was actually through things like Craigslist and those sorts of things. So if someone would post a job on like Craigslist or those things saying, I've got graphic design skills or something like that, then there'd be a script that would automatically email that person saying, you have graphic design skills, saw you out on Craigslist, here's a listing on freelancer.com. Airbnb did a similar thing as well in the US in terms of finding all the classified spaces of people renting out their apartment, and that was one of the channels that really kicked them up.
So what's your version of that?
Hopefully it's channel partnerships. Hopefully it's piggybacking off the back of some existing competitors. I mean, now that we're, I think, the largest or nearly the largest content aggregator in the professional development space online, learning management systems in the traditional sense, like Blackboard and Canvas and Moodle, why wouldn't they want to make their content offering more sticky? Why wouldn't they want to value add to their customer base so they never leave them? So how do you plug into that existing learning base rather than going up and signing up each individual customer, doing an implementation and then getting the license fees for a few years?
Have you got many competitors in the aggregation space?
Not yet. Yeah. There are some people playing around in particular verticals and industries, but ultimately the online learning space is still so incredibly fractured. You could have 3 different versions of a course, say Marketing 101 could be on Udemy, could be on Coursera, could be on LinkedIn Learning. And how do you possibly know which one's the best course? Because all the reviews are just reviewing that course, for example. There's no real marketplace dynamic at play for you to be able to find the most effective course with the best outcomes for you and the best learning experience. So that's what we're aiming to achieve, and there's no way to do it at this point in time.
So will you allow reviews and things like that?
Absolutely.
On all the courses, and you'll be kind of agnostic in terms of what courses you represent?
100%, yeah. We'll let the marketplace dynamic work that out.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah. I do have a few audience questions that we may have kind of passed in our chat. So let me jump back to a few other things that we've covered off, and we'll try and get these answered as well. What was your most challenging experience in establishing GO1 internationally?
So legals was one, legal and financing. I know it's a boring one, but it was really important to get right. Like incorporating in Delaware, we had to do a share roll-up scheme to transfer all the shares in the Australian company to the American company. I know some Australian accelerators now, I'm pretty sure Marudi is now requiring that their companies incorporate in Delaware so they have access to the US capital market. So I think that structural perspective can either make it really, really challenging to raise capital later, or it can make it very, very easy. So getting that right early on. But I think the biggest one has been maturity of remote management. It has been surprisingly difficult, particularly as sort of young founders who haven't done anything like this before, to manage remote staff in a really, really effective way. And primarily we think that's due to just one, a disconnect considering how fast startups move. Like you can be launching new parts of the system weekly, essentially, in different sprints, and someone that's sitting by themselves remote often, I think, feels out of the loop and can easily be left out of the loop. And the other is, as I say, a cultural thing. And how do you, like in a startup, things are always going to go wrong. There's always going to be good days and bad days. And how do you build that sense of having each other's back so that then when things do go wrong, everyone sort of rallies together to get things moving? And being able to build that culture across multiple offices, across different time zones is very tricky, and I don't think we've got it right yet. It's something we're working on very actively.
Are you also operating in different languages at the moment?
We are, yeah. So we operate in English, German, Malay, and Vietnamese, and Portuguese.
Sound like some very specific, chosen languages there.
All driven by customer demand.
Right, okay.
Yeah. So we don't actively go out and say we're going to release a French version of the platform. We have had lots of inquiries from Germany, say, or lots of inquiries from Malaysia. We need to fulfill and service this market appropriately. But I mean, that doesn't just mean translating the platform. That means customer support staff that speak those languages and all those sorts of things. Actually, one of the challenges I never expected was in platform translation. So we have a pretty simple skin overlay for different languages, quite a standard way to do it. But we have progress bars that we use to measure the translations in terms of how complete they are. And because we're iterating on the platform so quickly and we do fortnightly sprints and releases, it's amazing how quickly, so you do a full German translation of the system, 100%, and then within a month, it's down to like 40% translation. You need to go back and retranslate the system because you're releasing new UI elements. And this is something which we didn't even think would be something we need to take into account.
Yeah, so I guess it needs to be a process that you can kind of just continually operate as well.
Yeah, an ever-evolving story.
Yeah, great. And so no other plans at the moment to increase other languages, or you're kind of just waiting for that demand?
Yeah, not in the short term. I can definitely see it happening, but there's not like a defined strategy on which particular language we'll target next.
Okay. Can you talk any more about the potential redundancy of the SaaS model? Do you think it is kind of going to be redundant, or was this more of an opportunity that you saw to move away from that and differentiate?
I hope it will be redundant, and I think it will be eventually. Definitely in the education space. More difficult to speak in the finance sense. Like I can't really see Xero or those sorts of systems reducing their user license fees to nothing. But I think if you look at spaces where the aggregation is taking place, where people are coming to a source to purchase goods, to transact, those sorts of things, why would I pay $20 per user per month to use Blackboard for my students when I could use this free system that makes money off me, consuming content? And it's definitely, like, even since we started 3-4 years ago, the price wars in the learning SaaS space have gotten insane. Like you could have gotten away with charging $5 to $10 per user per month 3-4 years ago for a learning system for companies. Now that's just been down. Now we charge $1 per user per month for our learning system, and our revenues are shifting towards the content space. And I can see us making that absolutely free in a year's time, and just saying, here, have the system for free, use our marketplace and consume all the content you want.
Yeah, great. How many users are you up to now?
So we have 500,000 active users at the moment, with another chunk of contracted users that are yet to roll out.
Activate.
Yeah.
Great. And what kind of short-term, long-term projections are you aiming for there? Broadly speaking,
we'd like to hit 10 million users within a year.
Wow. Yeah. There you go.
Which is a scale question as well. When you start, one of our clients has sort of 40,000-50,000 users, and then this was back in the day, and they'll start logging in at once, and you see your server lines going, and your latency going up, and you're just freaking out. There's definitely a maturity of infrastructure question there as well, which we've had to continually evolve over time. We've rewritten our platform twice now. So we did our first version, We then released the second version, and now we've released our third version with entirely new architecture, which we're pretty proud of, but it's taken us 3 rewrites to get there.
Yeah, definitely. When and how did you hire your first staff, particularly software engineers?
Early. In fact, our major investment for the first 12 months was in engineering, because we did the sales for the first period. All of the founders, except for our lovely CTO, were required to sell, and that was to fund product development.
Yeah.
And therefore, for the first 12 months, pretty much all the revenue was in software development number 1, customer support number 2, and then we started hiring sales staff. Now it's shifted. Now we're investing a lot of money into hiring account executives to scale the sales team, and less so into customer support, because we're well-resourced in that space.
Can you tell us, out of your offices, what you have where and why? Like, for example, I know your marketing person's in America. You mentioned your tech team's in Vietnam.
Yeah.
So, and you've obviously got sales in the US.
Yeah.
What else is...
So the distribution is like Brizzy company. I don't think we'll ever leave Brisbane. It's a pretty great lifestyle. When the world is feeling really stressful, you can just go and have a walk around the Brisbane River. So river walks are how we de-stress. So we have a bit of everything in Brisbane. Like our CTO is sort of based out of Brisbane at least half the time. We have some senior developers in Brisbane who work on the strategy side of things. Our customer support team is headquartered in Brisbane, and we have a few sales representatives in Brisbane. So for the moment, we're still like the mothership is here. We have satellite sales offices, which is in Sydney and in San Francisco. Our marketing director is based in San Francisco, but he's an Aussie. It was kind of serendipitous how that all came together. So we have sort of satellite offices in Sydney and the US for sales. Malaysia was started due to Southeast Asia demand, and that's sales and customer support for the Southeast Asian region. And then Vietnam is fully development, which has taken us a few years to sort of grow and achieve that cultural fit and the process fit. But it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, great. Got a specific question here on what tech stack do you use? Have you got your own servers or AWS?
No, we're all on AWS. Couldn't afford our own servers yet. We're on the Aurora, AWS Aurora, which is pretty nice. We only moved to it a couple of weeks ago.
Great. What was your favourite part of being involved in the UN? Has it had any feedback into the business in opportunities or other ways? You did mention you had some benefit from that.
I mean, if you wanted to take the two polar opposites, you take a United Nations negotiating chamber and you take a startup. Like, in one negotiating session I was in, they spent 45 minutes negotiating over whether it was a comma or a full stop. Oh. So it was such a jarring experience to go from, startup land in Silicon Valley and in Underwood in Queensland, where things move at like this, to sitting in a negotiating room, like trying to get across your position in a way that doesn't offend anyone, in a way that, results in, I guess, a marginal improvement rather than a 3, 4, 5x improvement. Having said that, and those frustrations aside, I think it was an incredibly valuable experience because, the UN, if you look in terms of users and in terms of access to technology, the UN is unparalleled. UNICEF Innovation, if anyone's interested in the education space, UNICEF Innovation is doing some incredible things in the online education space, all funded by the UN and distributed out to their partner countries. And I think there is a lot of benefit to seeing some of the higher level pictures and the higher level trends of where different industries are going. And apart from just sort of the knowledge and I think awareness, there was opportunities out of it. Partially because startup has finally become a trendy thing in the UN. They're only 5-10 years behind the rest of the world. But to be building an innovative product, because of the nature of the bureaucratic restrictions on the UN, if you can be in those circles and be doing something that's fast moving and unique, you're actually seen as someone that's actually really worth getting to know, because you'll be the ones that shape the next future, and like the UN will catch up eventually, but they're really an admiration of people that go out there and build their businesses, which I didn't think. I thought they might snub their nose at someone building a small business out of Australia, but it wasn't the case at all. Great.
Final few questions. Here's an interesting one. When you've got 4 founders and you're deadlocked 2-2 in your decisions, how do you resolve it?
Hasn't happened, actually.
Really?
Yeah, in the entire history of the company, it hasn't happened to my memory. Flip a coin? I don't know. We've never thought about this. Now we take
There's
it
some
to
suggestions here. There was paper, rock, scissors, ping pong, beer pong.
We have a ping pong table, yeah, of course, and a beer fridge, like every startup does. We'd probably take it to the board these days, and they would rule with an iron fist. But yeah, it actually hasn't happened in.
That's
odd.
pretty amazing.
Yeah, I thought we would have done it.
Yeah, great. When raising capital, what key activities or connections have made the difference? Where did you find or connect with your investors when you initially, met them?
The very first place I met one of our investors, this is sort of even before we began capital raising or even thinking about capital raising, it was then called SidStart. I don't know what it's called now. It's a startup conference that was based in Sydney. This was in 2014, I think.
StartCon maybe? I
think it might have been rebranded to StartCon. And so that's where I bumped into an investor, and I didn't even know they were an investor. And was just chatting about what we do, and we just connected through there and stayed in contact, and they eventually came on board as one of our first angels. The value of networks in this space is just like unparalleled. Once we got one investor who had signed a convertible note, 2, 3, 4, like fear of missing out kicked in, and we had our whole round filled within a few weeks. So that first investor was definitely the hardest thing to get across, and probably always be the hardest thing to get across, but then they just tap the shoulders of the other people that they trust in the room. I think the Queensland investment scene is maturing at a really fast pace. I'm really, really pleased. So a number of our investors attend things like this all the time, super open to conversations. But I think if I had to give one bit of advice that we didn't have, that I think would be amazing for a startup now, it's a recommendation by another startup that someone's invested in. Because if a startup that's doing okay, or that has an investment from a company vouches for another startup, that means the world, and that opens up the door in a very sort of warm, welcoming way, rather than just the cold approaches.
Yeah, good advice. And I did interview Elaine Stead from Blue Sky a few months ago now, and I know one of her key messages was, make those relationships well before you do need any capital raising to happen.
We built those relationships, I'd say most of them 3 to 6 months before we decided to raise capital, but 1 or 2 of them up to 12 months beforehand.
Great.
It's kind of scary when you think about it.
Definitely. So to finish up, what is the ultimate goal for GO1 moving forward? Where to from here? You've talked about big users, obviously, and talked a fair bit about your direction. Is there any other kind of driving force behind where you're going from here?
One of the things that drives us, you can look at the user metrics and you can look at the financial metrics of a company, and that's what startups are usually measured on. But I think one of the things that's worked in our favor and really is about where we want the company to go is that we all have a really strong belief that online education needs to change and can be sort of revolutionized in the next 10 years, and that the impact that can have on society is substantial. It's not a narrative around, we can get these users and then scale and then sell off our data to Salesforce or something like that. It's that we genuinely believe that the online education space will be a game changer, and therefore that sort of motivates sort of all our actions moving forward. And so to have, I think, any real impact in this space, you need to achieve a little market dominance. And therefore, our ultimate goal is to be the major player in online corporate training before moving into offline training and being the aggregator for essentially all corporate training around the world.
Fantastic. I did have some more questions today. We have run out of time. I know if anyone's interested and you might be around a little bit longer, we did have some conversation around, corporate sales experience and things like that, which I think would be really interesting as well. So feel free to approach Chris afterwards and have a chat. But please join me in thanking Chris for his time today. We really appreciate it. Thank you.